Joining me now is former White House press secretary for President Trump and News Nation political contributor Sean Spicer, former Democratic advisor Dan Turrentine, and independent journalist Rachel Bade. They host the new YouTube show called The Huddle. Welcome back, guys. Thanks for being here. Sean, let me just start with you, because I know that you disagreed with Homeland Secretary Kristi Noem when she called Renee Good's actions domestic terrorism. You know, being from Oklahoma, when I think of domestic terrorism, I think of a Timothy McVeigh, right, with the Oklahoma City bombing. Is the administration overplaying its hand here?
I don't know that they're overplaying, but look, two things can be true at the same time. I don't think Renee Good went to that situation to harm anybody. But then again, I also don't know what's in her heart. But I can tell you from the evidence that I've seen, she wasn't there to harm anybody. But to Mills Hayes' reporting, she was there, like others, to disrupt. That's illegal. She parked her car in a way that was illegal. She tried to flee the scene. That's illegal after officers told her not to. So at the end of the day, when people put themselves in situations that are illegal.
All right, people, welcome back to Jack Mockler. At a Council Bluffs, Iowa rally, farmers and rural supporters, Trump's most reliable base, began booing and shouting, "You raised our costs," mid-speech. The president ripped off his microphone and walked away, leaving his speech unfinished and an arena full of his former believers watching their champion abandon them on stage. A public rejection that shattered the unbreakable bond between Trump and his loyalist coalition. Now, let's be very clear about why this moment matters so much more than the typical rally disruptions that political observers have become accustomed to. Trump rallies have always had their share of chaos. There have been protesters escorted out, technical difficulties that interrupt the flow, and awkward moments that become internet memes for a day or two.
That there are bad things that can happen. It's unfortunate the way that this thing went out ultimately, but I don't think she went there to harm anybody. That being said, and this is why I think two things can be true at the same time, when she revved her engine and turned her wheel, the officer had the right to defend himself and believe that he was under attack. So the advice, the thing that I find so funny about this whole situation, Marky, is for some reason we can't look at the situation and agree on certain facts. I agree that it's unfortunate that it turned out the way that it did. But I think that other people on the left should also be able to agree that when you go to disrupt a legal, lawful operation and you jump in the middle of it, bad things can happen.
And Dan, let me just, piggyback off what Sean was just saying there. How do you think Democrats need to handle this moment and its messaging, right? And it seems like everybody is fighting fire with fire. How do you navigate that line between, okay, we're going to push back on the Trump administration on this one, but at the same time...
Those things happen. Communications teams know how to spin them, and the base knows how to rationalize them. But what happened in Council Bluffs was categorically different from anything that came before. This wasn't an outsider causing trouble. This wasn't a Democratic operative trying to disrupt the event. These were Trump's own people, the farmers who have been the most loyal and steadfast supporters of his presidency, rising up in genuine anger against policies that have been devastating their livelihoods. This was a revolt from within, and there was no political playbook for handling it. The economic devastation that prompted this rebellion has been building for months, and it's important to understand exactly what the farmers in that arena
don't vilify law enforcement over it, who are out there doing their job. What say you on how Dems need to respond to this?
Yeah, it's a great point, Marky. We need to separate the personnel from the policy. As you were saying, we can object, as all Americans have the right to policies from our federal or state government, and you have a right to protest. But what you can't do is interfere, as Sean said, with federal law enforcement or state. Here in New York City, I would be upset if the police were rushing to an emergency or engaging in an action and people were blocking them from doing so. And I think this idea of kind of it's okay to throw snowballs or to try to stop or harm the personnel. They're doing their job, just as they did under Barack Obama when he deported hundreds of thousands of people. So you have to respect law enforcement. You have to respect that personnel are simply doing their job, even if you dislike it, but also have the right to protest. And I think part of the problem is I don't think a lot of these ICE agents are trained to handle the crowds they're confronting. It's getting, hot. As Sean said, people are trying to defend themselves.
Have been living through. The tariffs on Canada and Mexico that the administration has consistently defended as a brilliant economic strategy have been crushing the agricultural sector in ways that are deeply personal and economically catastrophic. Corn prices have plummeted by 25%, a devastating drop for farmers whose entire annual income depends on the harvest. Soybean prices have fallen by the same staggering amount, wiping out the value of the second most important crop grown in Iowa. These aren't abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. They represent the difference between staying in business and losing everything.
Protesters snap, the agents snap. It's a combustible situation.
Rachel, the escalating clash between these federal agents and the protesters on the ground has prompted Secretary Noem to send in even more agents to Minneapolis. You've got Governor Tim Walz saying, OK, I've got the National Guard on standby then. What do you see as being the potential political fallout from all of this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Marky. We're starting to see it right here in Washington. I mean, overnight or just a few hours ago, we got news that lawmakers had to drop Department of Homeland Security funding from this sort of package they were supposed to vote on today because Democrats are already sort of saying, look, we need to reassess policy when it comes to ICE. There's already talk about defunding ICE. And it's sort of crazy for me to say this right now because just a few years ago, Democrats, by and large, agreed that this notion of defund ICE that was very hot and popular with the base was just political suicide. And that really hurt them politically. But we are starting to see the emergence of that, starting with this sort of appropriations discussion today and not being able to move appropriations bills through Congress. Reminder, we've got a deadline at the end of the month, a potential shutdown around the corner. And so one thing I'm going to be watching is to see if Democratic leaders follow this sort of fury we're seeing it with the base right now and demanding.
They represent loan payments that can't be met, equipment that can't be replaced, and operations that simply cannot survive. Farm bankruptcies have surged by a staggering 40%, a number that is so shocking and so significant that it deserves to be repeated. 40%. That's not just a statistic that exists in some government report. That's families losing farms that have been in their possession for generations. That's neighbors filing for bankruptcy protection and watching their life's work disappear. That's entire rural communities watching their economic foundation crack in real time. And the people experiencing that devastation showed up to a Trump rally in their own state, expecting what they have always received from his events, which is validation and energy, and the feeling that someone in Washington understands their struggles. Instead, they got a speech about how the tariffs are actually working, and the trade war is a tremendous success, and they simply couldn't accept it anymore. The half-empty venue is just as significant as the booing, and the two phenomena tell the same devastating story from different angles. Trump rallies have always been defined by their energy and their crowd sizes. The president talks constantly about the overflow lines and the packed arenas, treating them as the ultimate proof of his connection to the American people. A half-empty arena in Iowa, a state where Trump's support among rural voters has been among his strongest anywhere in the country, isn't just a scheduling mishap or an off night for the event planning team. It's a signal of something much deeper and more troubling. It means the people who would normally fill that venue decided not to come. They decided the trip wasn't worth making, that they had better things to do than attend a rally for a president whose policies have been cutting into their livelihoods in ways they can no longer ignore. The empty seats and the booing are not separate issues. They are the same underlying problem expressing itself in two different ways. One is the passive expression of withdrawal, staying home instead of showing up. The other is the active expression of anger, showing up and making it known exactly how they feel. Both together in Iowa from Trump's own agricultural base constitute a political warning sign of the first order. The man who built his political identity on connecting with regular Americans, on reading the mood of the crowd, on feeding off the energy of his supporters, found himself utterly unable to respond to this moment. Trump's entire political brand has been based on his supposed ability to handle pressure, to thrive in hostile environments, to feed off conflict, and to turn attacks into energy. He has always described his relationship with criticism as something he welcomes, something that makes him stronger, something he never backs down from. But the Council Bluffs moment revealed a crucial limitation in that persona. there is a specific kind of criticism that breaks the pattern completely. Criticism from his own people, about his own policies, in his own strongest territory. He can handle Democratic opponents attacking him. He can handle the media asking hostile questions. He can handle protesters outside his events. All of those are enemies he has defined as enemies, people whose opposition he can dismiss and redirect into energy for his base. But farmers in Iowa shouting that his tariffs have devastated them are not political enemies he can dismiss. They are his people. They are the constituency whose loyalty has been the very foundation of his political power. And when they turned on him, he had no playbook for it, no talking point that would work, no attack that was available. And so he did the only thing left to him. He ripped off the microphone and walked out, leaving his speech unfinished and his staff scrambling. The image of that moment will be one of the defining political memories of this entire presidency. The microphone ripped away from his face, the abrupt turn toward the exit, the stunned staff members left behind on stage, unsure of what to do next, the half-empty arena full of farmers watching their president walk away from them. That image is going to be replayed in campaign ads and news coverage for months, serving as a permanent reminder of the moment when the unbreakable bond between Trump and his rural base finally broke. Political analysts have been saying for years that such a moment could never happen, that the base would remain loyal no matter what, that the connection between Trump and his supporters was too strong to be broken by policy disagreements or economic hardship. But it happened, on camera, in Iowa, in front of everyone, and the aftershocks are still being felt across the Republican Party's midterm calculations. This wasn't just a bad rally day. This was a base fracture, and it represents the most visible and dramatic confirmation yet of a pattern that political observers have been documenting for months. The administration has been implementing policies that carry real costs for real people, trade costs from tariffs that disrupt the agricultural economy, while describing those policies publicly in terms that simply don't acknowledge the human consequences. And when the people bearing those costs encounter the public description of those policies, when they sit in a room where the president is telling them that the tariffs are great and the trade war is working while they are living the reality of commodity price collapses and bankruptcy filings, the gap between the description and the reality becomes impossible to paper over. The Council Bluffs rally exposed that gap in the most visceral and direct way yet, in a room full of Trump's own supporters who looked him in the face and told him directly that what he has been saying doesn't match what they are living. And he walked off the stage because there was no answer available that would close the gap in a room full of people who know exactly what the reality is. Let's dig deeper into the specific economic mechanisms that have produced this political disaster, because understanding exactly how the tariffs have devastated Iowa farmers is essential to grasping why the Council Bluffs rally spiraled into such a catastrophic failure. The tariffs on Canada and Mexico that have been a central feature of the administration's economic policy disrupted agricultural trade relationships that American farmers had built and depended on over decades. These aren't peripheral customers for American agricultural products. Canada and Mexico are among the largest and most consistent buyers of American corn, soybeans, pork, and other agricultural commodities. They buy American farm products because trade agreements made those products competitively priced and reliably available. And when tariffs went up, when the cost of American agricultural products in Canadian and Mexican markets increased dramatically, those markets responded in exactly the way basic economics predicts. They started buying from elsewhere, from Brazil and Argentina and other agricultural exporters who weren't hitting them with tariffs and who were happy to fill the demand that American farms had previously served. American farmers who had planted their crops, who had taken out their operating loans, who had made their production decisions based on market conditions that existed before the tariffs, suddenly found themselves holding commodities they simply could not sell at prices that would cover their costs. The entire agricultural business model depends on a careful balance between input costs and output prices. Farming is a capital-intensive, debt-dependent business operating on razor-thin margins. Farmers borrow money in the spring to purchase seed, fertilizer, fuel, and equipment maintenance, and they repay those loans in the fall when they sell their harvest. The entire operation depends on the relationship between what it costs to produce the crop and what the crop sells for remaining within a range that allows the debt to be serviced and the operation to continue. The tariffs attacked both sides of that equation simultaneously and with devastating effectiveness. On the input side, fertilizer, fuel, and equipment components became significantly more expensive because of tariffs on goods imported from Canada, Mexico, and other countries that supply those critical agricultural inputs. Farmers found themselves paying more for everything they needed to plant and harvest their crops. On the output side, the commodities they grow lost significant value because the export markets that had traditionally bought them were disrupted by the same tariff policy. Input costs going up and output prices going down, both movements driven by the same administration policy, and the margin between those two numbers collapsed in ways that are now showing up as the 40% surge in farm bankruptcies that has agricultural economists so alarmed. That 40% increase is not an abstract statistic. It represents families losing farms that have been in their possession for generations. It represents neighbors watching the bankruptcy process up close and calculating how close they themselves are to the same devastating outcome. It represents local businesses that serve the agricultural community, equipment dealers, seed suppliers, feed stores, whose revenue disappears when farms stop operating. It represents rural banks, whose agricultural loan portfolios are deteriorating as crop values collapse and operating margins evaporate. All of these people, all of these economic actors in rural communities are watching the farm bankruptcy rate climb and drawing conclusions about whose policies caused it and whose policies might stop it. And those conclusions are not favorable to the political party that implemented the tariffs that disrupted the export markets that produced the price collapses that are driving the bankruptcies. The connection between the tariff damage and the broader budget and spending picture makes the situation even more galling for the farmers suffering from these policies. The budget priorities of the administration are directing money toward military operations and deportation efforts rather than toward the agricultural support programs that farming communities depend on. Farmers are experiencing the costs of the tariff policy without receiving compensating benefits through the budget process. They are getting squeezed from both directions: higher input costs from the tariffs and reduced program support from the budget cuts, while the revenue their economic pain is generating flows into a budget that prioritizes other things entirely. That is the economic reality underneath the political drama of the Council Bluffs meltdown, and when Trump walked off that stage, rather than addressing it, rather than explaining how the tariff pain would eventually produce benefits that would reach the farmers who were currently suffering, he demonstrated that there is no explanation available that holds up in a room full of people living the consequences of the policy in real time. Now let's talk about the House Republican defections that accompanied this rally disaster, because they represent the same political story being expressed in a different institutional setting. 6 House Republicans voted against the tariffs, a development that matters as much as the rally meltdown and is part of the same underlying political dynamic. When members of the president's own party in the House of Representatives vote against his signature economic policy, they aren't doing it for ideological reasons in the abstract. They are doing it because they have heard from the people in their districts, because farmers and agricultural businesses and rural communities in their constituencies have been calling their offices and showing up at their town halls and writing letters and making very clear that the tariff policy is producing economic damage that the congressional representatives are going to be held accountable for if they don't act. 6 members voting against is the leading edge of what could become a much larger defection if the economic conditions in agricultural districts continue to deteriorate. It is the congressional expression of the same political reality that produced the booing in Council Bluffs. Farmers are not going to show up to vote for representatives who supported a policy that drove them toward bankruptcy, and representatives who understand that reality are starting to make the political calculation that loyalty to the tariff policy is not worth the electoral cost. The 6 who voted against are the ones who have either the safest seats or the most acute constituent pressure. As the farm economy continues to suffer, and as the midterms approach, that number is going to be watched very carefully by everyone in the Republican caucus who represents a district where agriculture matters to the electoral math. The political machinery that has managed every previous wave of criticism against Trump simply does not have a mechanism for processing this kind of opposition from his own supporters. The entire architecture of how his political operation has managed criticism since the beginning has depended on being able to characterize opposition as coming from enemies, from Democrats, from the media, from coastal elites, from globalists, from the deep state. Whatever the specific framing, the consistent logic has been that criticism of Trump comes from people who are always his opponents and whose opposition therefore does not represent genuine public sentiment, but rather a coordinated political attack. That framing works perfectly when the criticism comes from those sources. It completely breaks down when the criticism comes from an Iowa corn farmer who voted for Trump by massive margins and who is now standing in his rallies shouting that his policies have devastated them. You cannot call an Iowa farmer a coastal elite. You cannot describe a corn farmer driven toward bankruptcy by tariff-disrupted export markets as a deep state operative. The rhetorical machinery that has managed every previous wave of criticism simply doesn't work when the criticism comes from the president's own base. The mic rip and the walkout rather than the defiant counterattack that his supporters have been conditioned to expect confirmed that the playbook failed completely. He had no answer, and everyone in that room and everyone who watched the clip knew it. The image of that moment is going to be one of the defining political memories of this entire presidency, a visual representation of the moment when the base turned and the president fled rather than facing the anger of his own people. And that image is going to be replayed in campaign ads and news coverage for months, serving as a constant reminder of the economic devastation that the tariff policy has brought to rural America and the political consequences that devastation is producing. This pattern of base erosion is something that political analysts have been tracking for months, but the Council Bluffs rally represents its most dramatic and visible manifestation. The farmers who booed Trump did not show up planning to boo him. They showed up because they had been living with the consequences of his tariff policies for months, and those consequences have been landing on them in ways that are personal and immediate and devastating in a way that abstract policy arguments never are. They showed up expecting what they have always gotten at Trump rallies, which is validation and energy and the sense that someone in Washington understands their lives. Instead, they got a speech about how the tariffs are great and the trade war is working, and the gap between that description and their lived reality was simply too wide to ignore. Now let's bring everything together and examine the full scope of what the Council Bluffs meltdown means for the political landscape heading into the midterms, because there's a lot of dramatic surface material in this story, and it's important to make sure the substantive significance lands clearly. This is the moment when the agricultural base fracture became undeniable, and it represents the most dangerous kind of political rupture for any Republican coalition because it is impossible to dismiss or reframe as partisan opposition. The people who booed Trump in that arena are not Democrats. They are not liberals. They are not coastal elites or deep state operatives. They are Iowa farmers who voted for Trump by enormous margins, who have defended his policies for years, who have been the most reliable supporters of his presidency. And when they turned on him, when they shouted directly at him that his policies have devastated them, the political consequences were devastating in a way that no amount of spin can repair. The 40% surge in farm bankruptcies is the economic indicator that Republican rural strategists are most frightened by, and it deserves far more public attention than it has received. Farm bankruptcies are not just an economic statistic. They are a political earthquake in slow motion. When a farm goes bankrupt, when a family loses land that has been in their possession for generations, the political consequences ripple outward through the entire rural community. Neighbors who are not yet bankrupt, but who are watching the bankruptcy process up close and calculating how close they are to the same outcome. Local businesses that serve the farm community whose revenue disappears when farms stop operating. Rural banks whose agricultural loan portfolios are deteriorating as crop values collapse and operating margins evaporate. All of these people are watching the farm bankruptcy rate climb and drawing conclusions about whose policies caused it and whose policies might stop it. The 2026 election cycle is shaping up to be a referendum on the economic devastation that the tariff policy has brought to rural America. The farmers who booed Trump in Council Bluffs represent the leading edge of a much larger political movement that is going to manifest itself at the ballot box. Every rural district that Republicans have historically treated as safe is now potentially in play because the people who live in those districts are suffering economically in ways that are directly attributable to the administration's trade policies. The farm bankruptcy rate is climbing, commodity prices are collapsing, and the people experiencing that devastation are not going to forget who caused it when they step into the voting booth. The Council Bluffs rally meltdown is the most visible and dramatic confirmation yet of a pattern that political observers have been documenting across every major policy domain. This administration has been implementing policies that carry real costs for real people while describing those policies publicly in terms that do not acknowledge the costs. The tariff policy has carried trade costs for farmers. The budget priorities have carried cuts to domestic programs. And when the people bearing those costs encounter the public description of those policies, when they are in a room where the president is telling them that the tariffs are great and the trade war is working while they are living the reality of commodity price declines and bankruptcy rate increases, the gap between the description and the reality becomes impossible to paper over. The Council Bluffs rally exposed that gap in the most visceral and direct way yet, in a room full of Trump's own supporters who looked him in the face and told him that what he has been saying does not match what they are living, and he walked off the stage because there was no answer available that would close that gap. The 6 House Republican defections on the tariff votes are the leading edge of a potentially much larger congressional revolt that the administration needs to take more seriously than its public response has suggested. When members of Congress vote against their own president's signature economic policy in numbers that are visible and documented and that can be cited by their constituents, they are doing something that has consequences beyond the immediate vote. They are creating permission. They are telling other members in similar electoral situations that it is survivable politically and institutionally to break with the administration on this specific issue. They are demonstrating that the political cost of opposing the tariffs is lower than the political cost of defending them in agricultural districts. And once that permission exists, once the precedent of survivable defection is established, the calculus for every other vulnerable Republican member changes. The question is no longer whether it is possible to vote against the tariffs without destroying your relationship with the party leadership. That question has been answered by the 6 who did it. The question is now whether the electoral math in your specific district makes it necessary to join them. And as the farm bankruptcy numbers continue to climb, and as the Council Bluffs moment gets replayed in campaign ads and local news coverage in agricultural districts across the country, more members are going to conclude that the answer to that question is yes. The political damage to the rural coalition that has been the foundation of Republican electoral success is now documented on camera, undeniable, and impossible to spin away. Trump going to Iowa, his territory, his voters, his most reliable constituency, and getting booed off the stage by farmers whose livelihoods have been damaged by his tariff policies represents the most dramatic moment of political reckoning this administration has faced. The venue was half empty. The booing was loud enough and sustained enough that he ripped off his microphone and walked out without finishing his speech. Farm bankruptcies are up 40%. Corn and soybean prices are down 25%. 6 House Republicans have already voted against the tariffs. and the political damage to the rural coalition that has been the foundation of Republican electoral success is now documented on camera, undeniable, and impossible to spin away. This is not a bad rally day. This is a base fracture, the moment when the people who were supposed to be the most reliable supporters of this administration looked up from the economic damage they are living and said directly, loudly, in public that the policies causing that damage are unacceptable. And the president's response was to leave. The image of that moment, the microphone ripped off, the stage abandoned, the stunned staff, the half-empty arena of former believers, is going to define a central chapter of the 2026 midterm story. And the Republican Party is going to be dealing with the consequences of that image and the economic reality underneath it every single day between now and November. What happened in Council Bluffs wasn't just a single bad moment. It was the culmination of months of economic pressure and political betrayal that has been building in rural communities across America. The farmers who showed up to that rally came hoping for answers, hoping for some acknowledgement that the administration understands what they're going through, hoping for some indication that their suffering is being taken seriously. Instead, they got a president who couldn't even finish his speech because the anger in the room was too much for him to handle. The message that sent was devastating. The president either doesn't understand what his policies are doing to his most loyal supporters, or he understands and simply doesn't care. Neither possibility is acceptable to people who are watching their livelihoods disappear. The long-term consequences of this political disaster are going to extend far beyond the 2026 election cycle. The fracture in the relationship between Trump and his agricultural base is not the kind of thing that heals quickly or easily. Farmers who have been driven toward bankruptcy by tariff policies are not going to forget who caused their suffering just because the administration eventually changes course. The trust that was broken in that arena is going to take years to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. And the images of that moment are going to be seared into the political memory of rural America for a long time to come. Pay very close attention to how the agricultural numbers move over the next few months. The corn prices, the soybean prices, the farm bankruptcy rate, the agricultural loan delinquency numbers, all of these metrics are going to determine a lot about what happens in rural districts that Republicans simply cannot afford to lose. If the economic conditions continue to deteriorate, the political consequences are going to be devastating. If the administration finally takes action to address the damage its policies have caused, there might be some chance of limiting the political fallout. But either way, the Council Bluffs moment represents a political turning point that is going to reverberate through American politics for years to come. The pattern of base erosion that produced this disaster is something that political analysts have been tracking for months, and it represents the central vulnerability of this administration heading into the midterms. The implementation of policies that carry real costs for real people, combined with a public relations strategy that refuses to acknowledge those costs, has created a gap between the administration's description of its policies and the reality experienced by its supporters. And when that gap becomes too wide to ignore, as it did in Council Bluffs, the political consequences are devastating. The Council Bluffs rally was the moment when the gap between description and reality became impossible to paper over, and the president responded by walking away because there was simply no answer available that would close that gap in a room full of people who know exactly what the reality is. That gap, documented repeatedly and appearing across every major policy domain, is the central political vulnerability of this administration heading into the midterms. And the Council Bluffs moment is going to stand as one of the clearest and most powerful visual representations of it. The image of the president walking off stage, his speech unfinished, his staff stunned, his supporters booing, is going to be replayed in campaign ads and news coverage for months. It represents everything that has gone wrong in the relationship between this administration and the people who were supposed to be its most loyal supporters. And the consequences of that broken relationship are going to be felt at the ballot box in ways that no amount of political spin can prevent.